Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 3.34, Saturn's Children. On March the 13th, 1793, a few days after the first aborted attempt by the Enragé agitators to purge the National Convention of the Girondin delegates, one of those Girondins stood up to deliver a prophetic verdict on the direction of the revolution. Now, so far in the show, I have not mentioned Pierre Verne by name, because I think we can all agree that too many names spoils the broth, but he is widely considered to have been one of the greatest orators of the revolution. He was one of the driving forces behind the push for war with Austria. His speeches helped topple the Fouillon ministry, and he was one of the most eloquent advocates of the appeal to the people during the trial of King Louis. For all of this, he was of course one of the 22 specifically named Girondins the Enragé wanted purged from the convention. Denouncing the recent run of lawlessness and violence, which was clearly ushering in a new kind of tyranny that was as opposed to true liberty as the old tyranny of the Ancien regime. And he famously warned, "So, citizens, it must be feared that the revolution, like Saturn, successively devouring its children, will engender finally only despotism, with the calamities that accompany it." And of course, here we are 6 months later. The Committee of Public Safety is setting itself up as a joint dictatorship, and Verne himself is about to be led to the guillotine. But as much as Verne's speech is often portrayed as a prophecy of things to come, it's clear that he was speaking of a process that had been a part of the revolution from the very beginning. And as we stand here now on the brink of the Reign of Terror, when the revolution truly begins to gorge herself, it's worth taking a moment to look back and recognize just how many had already been eaten. Remember back in episode 3.5 when the Assembly of Notables resisted Controller General Calonne's reform package and were hailed for standing up to royal tyranny? Yeah, well, those guys have all been now driven into counter-revolutionary exile. Remember in episode 3.7 when the councillors of the Parlement became the leaders in the fight for French liberty? Well, then in episode 3.9, they came out against doubling the third and voting by head, so when the Parlement were unceremoniously abolished in 1790, no one shed a tear. Remember Jean-Joseph Mounier? He was a huge part of getting the Estates General called in episode 3.8, and then he went out and organized the Monarchian Coalition in episode 3.13 that dominated the early days of the National Convention. And what happened to Mounier? He quit the National Assembly in disgust after the Women's March on Versailles, and then had to sneak off to Switzerland after being branded a reactionary. Remember the liberal nobles of the Society of 1789, guys like Lafayette, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and Talleyrand, who had done so much to get the revolution off the ground, and who held all the key ministerial positions in episode 3.16 and 3.17, which was right around the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. Well, all those guys have now been forced into retirement or exile for being way too conservative. Bailly is about to get his head chopped off. And then along came the Fouillon in episode 3.20, the constitutional monarchists led by the triumvirate of Duport and Lameth and Barnave, who rose up after the flight to Varennes and who finally completed the Constitution of 1791. Well, they were all branded traitors after the insurrection of August the 10th. Duport and Lameth have fled into exile. Barnave is currently sitting in a jail cell, and he too is about to get his head chopped off. And now here we are approaching the end of the Girondins, on whose behalf the Paris streets had stormed the royal apartments of the Tuileries Palace in episode 3.22. Less than a year later, those same streets are now demanding the Girondins be purged from the body politic. So when Verne gave his speech in March 1793, he was not speaking as an oracle divining the future. He was just reporting on the very obvious course of revolutionary history, where it had been and where it was now obviously going. So when last we left Paris, the insurrection of September the 5th had led directly to the final pieces of the Reign of Terror being put into place, most especially the Law of Suspects, which opened the door for basically anyone to denounce anyone else for any reason. Before the Law of Suspects was passed, there were maybe 1,500 people locked up in the various prisons of the capital. By December, that number will have shot up to 4,500, and this was a pattern that would repeat itself across France, and soon enough somewhere on the order of 500,000 people would find themselves in custody. And those numbers should tell you something, though, right away, something that's worth keeping in mind when we get into the chilling efficiency of the guillotine. The Reign of Terror only has about 16,000 official victims, and those killed in Paris numbered only about 2,600. So as much as being arrested by the revolutionary authorities might feel like an immediate death sentence, most people who were arrested were either acquitted, and we'll get to that in a second, or they languished in custody long enough to survive until the Thermidorian reaction. Now, those numbers don't count the tens of thousands killed by things like the infernal columns or in random street murders, which still went on pretty regularly, but still, compared to the horrific 20th century political slaughters in like Stalinist Russia, Nazi Germany, and the Cambodian killing fields that consumed millions of people, the Reign of Terror turns out looking positively humane. But despite the relatively low conversion of arrests to executions, things were definitely getting more vigorous and more streamlined once terror became the order of the day. Prior to the insurrection of September the 5th, the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris actually operated with a degree of objectivity. For most of 1793, those trials were not, for the most part, show trials. You could get a lawyer to help you out, and you could even offer a defense, and if the defense was plausible, you would be acquitted. Everyone involved in the process took a certain amount of pride in making sure that they only killed the real enemies of France. Now, of course, since we've been talking a lot about the routine executions of all those revolutionary generals, you may have thought that the terror has really already revved up to peak irrational bloodlust. But between March and September 1793, only 66 people were actually guillotined. The generals were just in a special class all their own. To maintain the legitimacy of the central revolutionary government, it was essential that the failure of the French armies in the field be pinned squarely on treasonous or deliberately negligent officers. It was politically impossible to say, oh, well, our troops just aren't really that good, because everyone was irreversibly committed to the propaganda that the sans-culotte citizen soldier was just made of superior moral and military fiber. And you didn't want to say, oh, well, the guy we put in charge was incompetent, Hushar, because someone then might ask, well, if he's so incompetent, then why did you put him in charge? So better than to say that the general intentionally deceived us and committed treason and conspired with the enemy, and now we're killing him for betraying the nation. So yes, if you were a failed general, the tribunal was absolutely going to smear your good name and then chop your head off. But aside from those guys, you actually did have a decent shot at surviving if you were denounced. Now, of course, that very willingness to at least appear impartial was not going to fly in some quarters, specifically those quarters that read the newspaper of Jacques Hébert. After Hébert became the voice of the people, he used that voice to hammer on those who were willing to indulge in moderation. And in fact, both those words were soon turned into political epithets, and not too long after that, it would be a crime all on its own to be an indulgent or a moderate. In his war on moderation, there were two big questions that Hébert demanded answers to all through the summer of 1793. Why does Queen Marie Antoinette yet live when we know that she conspired with the Austrians to destroy us? And why do the Girondins yet live when we know that they were the architects of the Federalist uprising? The pounding rhetoric of Hébert was in fact one of the reasons Danton and his guys were bounced from the Committee of Public Safety, since Danton advocated hateful moderation, and specifically keeping the Queen alive to use as a bargaining chip with the Allies. Now, as you'll recall, immediately after being tossed out of the convention, the proscribed Girondins had been placed under a loose house arrest, as if the authorities were a little sheepish about what they were doing. But then individual Girondins started trying to slip out of Paris, and the grip had to tighten up a little bit. But though Pétion and a few other guys did manage to escape up to Normandy, the others who tried to make good their escape, including Jacques-Pierre Brissot, were tracked down and reapprehended. After the insurrection of September the 5th, the authorities prepared to prosecute them all as a group, and in anticipation of their trial, they were moved to the Conciergerie, the prison known around town as the Antechamber of Death. On October the 3rd, the Committee of General Security started presenting their formal indictments of the Girondins, and soon brought them all before the Revolutionary Tribunal. But though the trial of the Girondins was meant to be a preordained public demonstration of their collective guilt, the rules and procedures of the tribunal was still set up to function as an actual trial. And the Girondins were nothing if not razor-sharp lawyers and excellent public speakers. So they were able to deftly parry every prosecutorial thrust. In a big way, it was the eloquence and persuasiveness of the Girondins that induced the Committee of Public Safety to step in and say, no more of this objective rule of law baloney. We know who's guilty. From here on out, we're going to bring the accused forward, announce the verdict, next case. And it would not be until after Thermidor that the accused would once again really have an opportunity to defend themselves. The prosecution went after the Girondins from a couple of different angles, and all those angles stalled out as the defendants started refuting the holy living hell out of all the charges. The biggest quagmire the prosecutors ran into was proving that the Girondins were in fact an organized faction. Now, these were the days when party and faction were still considered subversive and anti-democratic. And as I mentioned when I first started talking about the Girondins and the Mountain, those are convenient labels that help us group people together. But once you start actually trying to prove that they are a close-knit party working towards a shared goal, it all kind of starts to fall apart, as the prosecutors soon discovered. One by one, the Girondins stood up and argued, look, I might be friends with these guys, but I did this when they all did that, and they all did that, well, I did this. And sure, we get together for drinks, but for crying out loud, I voted against the appeal to the people. And then the next guy would get up and make his own version of the same case. With the attempt to prove this group of individuals were actually a single-minded party going nowhere, the prosecution moved on to its two big accusations, one of which was preposterous, the other was at least plausible. The preposterous claim was that the Girondins had been closet royalists all along, and that they had spent all that time pushing for war against Austria because they wanted France to lose. Now this was, of course, utterly insane. Yes, the little round of secret negotiations with the king just before the insurrection of August the 10th didn't look good, but accusing them of being crypto-royalists? That is nuts. Most of them were early and honest Republicans. And the idea that the war with Austria was about intentionally getting France into a war it couldn't win? Brissot wanted that war because he was willfully blind to the weakness of the French army, not because he wanted to exploit that weakness on behalf of the king. But the charge that was far more believable was that the Girondins had orchestrated the Federalist insurrection and had intentionally tried to divide the Republic from itself. Rather than getting bogged down in the other accusations, I think that this is really where the prosecutors should have focused all their attention. The Girondins were on the record asking for armed troops from the provinces to come occupy Paris. They had made threats about literally wiping the capital off the map. The few of them who had successfully escaped after the purge had put themselves at the head of armed Federalists and declared against the convention. You focus on that one line, and I think this trial wraps up in a much neater package. But by introducing the other patently absurd charges, the prosecutors gave the Girondins the opportunity to make incredulous and thoroughly persuasive rebuttals. By the middle of October, the trial was dragging on, and nailing down an irrefutable conviction was looking dicey. Just as the trial of the Girondins was getting going, the Committee of Public Safety made another move in the direction of just wholesale abandoning the rule of law. On October the 10th, a motion was passed through the convention permanently suspending the Constitution of 1793. The government of France would now be, quote, revolutionary until the peace. And by revolutionary, they meant the opposite of constitutional government. Basically, the nation was now officially being run by an emergency government until the war was won and France was safe. The Committee of Public Safety was then further led to believe that their emergency powers could not be abandoned when Fabre d'Eglantina approached Robespierre and Saint-Just and requested an audience with them and representatives of the Committee of General Security. Now, d'Eglantina, you might remember, was one of the old Cordelier Club guys and an intimate of Danton and Desmoulins. Well, I hinted once upon a time that Danton would come to regret letting d'Eglantina rise to power with him. And it's right about now that the regret is going to start sinking in. Well, not quite yet. d'Eglantina is still playing his hand pretty well. On October the 12th, he met with Robespierre and Saint-Just and the Committee of General Security and proceeded to lay out the details of what has since been dubbed the Foreign Plot, an intertwined conspiracy of treasonous Frenchmen and foreign agents in Paris working to undermine the revolution, mostly with money provided by the British. As we've seen, the revolutionaries were always susceptible to a good conspiracy theory, and paranoia had become something of a default position. When d'Eglantina laid all this out, Robespierre appears to have swallowed the whole thing hook, line, and sinker, especially the part about an agent of the foreign plot working inside the Committee of Public Safety itself. Robespierre had always been concerned about the committee being infiltrated, and so it might have even come as something of a relief that he finally had a real suspect, and a plausible suspect at that, Marie-Jeanne Hérault de Seychelles. Hérault was already a suspicious character, and it's somewhat surprising that he was even still on the Committee of Public Safety, being as he was of noble blood. Born in 1759, Hérault managed to secure an appointment as a king's advocate at the age of 20, that being the same job Danton would hold down before the Revolution. But like many of his noble brethren, Hérault was a man of the liberal Enlightenment, and he was well prepared to join the Revolution once it got going. He was not elected to the Estates General, but he was appointed a judge in Paris when the legal reform started kicking in. Then he was sent on the first of many missions to Alsace to keep the border territories from resisting the revolution, or worse yet, trying to break away completely. He was elected into the Legislative Assembly in 1791 and sat on the far left, and was by now a close working associate of Georges Danton. Appointed to the Diplomatic Committee, he continued to mostly serve the government on missions to the frontier departments, all of which in retrospect would make him look like the perfect candidate for an alleged foreign plot, which is probably why d'Eglantina pointed at him. But still, his revolutionary credentials were pretty impeccable. He helped organize the insurrection of August the 10th, and though he was absent from Paris for the trial of the king, he made no secret that he supported death with no appeal. With his strong background in law, he was appointed by the convention to serve on the Constitutional Committee alongside Saint-Just, which is how Hérault winds up on the Committee of Public Safety. Once there, he became something like de facto foreign minister, handling almost all the committee's diplomatic business. Now, other than his frequent dealings with foreigners, which is pretty unavoidable if you're the de facto foreign minister, it was easy for Robespierre to suspect Hérault. Because unlike the more deadly serious revolutionaries, like José Robespierre, you kind of get the feeling that Hérault thought this was all a great game. He was a cultivated and well-dressed dandy. He was a noble. He was quick-witted and quick to make a little sarcastic joke, even at his own expense. He cast a cynical eye on the world and found it full of ironies and opportunities for pleasure. So needless to say, he was not an austere true believer. So when d'Eglantina said Hérault was now selling secrets to the Austrians and his advocacy for even more aggressive war was a two-faced attempt to lead France into some kind of trap, Robespierre was absolutely ready to believe it. But Hérault had too many friends to make any move on him just yet, so for the moment, Robespierre elected to bide his time. In addition to giving Robespierre an inner circle member of the Committee of Public Safety to keep an eye on, what d'Eglantina's foreign plot did was really start to help Robespierre narrow the definition of politically acceptable behavior. Those too far to the left or too far to the right were obviously just working with enemies of France to destroy or discredit the revolution. Robespierre began formulating this guiding rubric that classified some men as being cis-revolutionaries who fell unacceptably short of perfection, most prominent among those being the Girondins. And then he classified other men as ultra-revolutionaries, men like Jacques Hébert, who went unacceptably too far beyond perfection. The ultras were likely in the pay of foreign enemies, and the tactics they adopted and the programs they advocated were clearly meant to do nothing but bring the revolution into disrepute and fatally weaken its legitimacy. So, what is the thing in the middle that you were either falling short of or going too far beyond? Basically, Robespierre himself. He considered himself the standard by which everyone else would be measured. And that is why it's about to get very bad for everyone else. But before we move on, you do have to know that the foreign plot was completely made up. A fiction conjured out of thin air by Deglantina. Why? Well, as we'll discuss when I come back from my break, Deglantina is just corrupt as all get out, and he had been using the levers of revolutionary government to extort money from everyone he thought he could strong-arm into paying. Realizing that his shenanigans were about to come out into the open, he concocted an elaborate story that implicated all his enemies. By beating them to the denunciation punch, he was able to insulate himself from their very real accusations against him, because it would just look like they were attacking him to save themselves. And this would work for a while too, but not forever. And also, just so you know, before he goes down, Deglantina will make one other major contribution to the revolution, which we'll be talking about next week, in the first of a series of supplementals I've cooked up to keep you busy while I'm off on the tours. Now, as the myth of the foreign plot began to seep its way into the political firmament, and as the Revolutionary Tribunal continued to struggle with the Girondins, there was another matter everyone could turn their attention to who would give them a nice outlet for their fear without anyone getting up in arms about totally ditching the rule of law. It was time to bring Queen Marie Antoinette, now dubbed the Widow Capet, to justice. And since the execution of Louis back in January, the Queen and the rest of the royal family had remained in the temple. Though they were not treated terribly just yet, there was nothing comfortable or comforting about their captivity, and they were closely monitored day and night. But if the Queen was hoping to make it through all of this in one piece, she did very little to earn the sympathy of her captors, as she pointedly treated her 8-year-old son as if he was now King Louis XVII, doing stuff like insisting that the boy be served first at meals and teaching him his place in the great royal hierarchy. But at this point, I think the Queen could probably see this all coming to an end two possible ways. Either the revolution would ultimately collapse from the dual pressure of civil war at home and invasion from abroad, in which case keeping the royal candle burning was essential to maintaining the continuity of an eventually restored monarchy. And if the revolution didn't collapse, they were probably all going to be killed anyway, so there's no sense in doing anything but going out an unrepentant martyr. But this posture did her son no favors, and so on the night of July the 3rd, Louis XVII was removed from his mother's care and handed over to a semi-literate cobbler who was ordered to raise the boy as a proper Republican. About a week after her son was taken, Danton got the boot from the Committee of Public Safety, and the conditions of the Queen's captivity got considerably worse. On August the 1st, she was rousted in the middle of the night and moved down to the conciergerie. She was watched over day and night in a tiny little cell and given exactly zero privacy. Over the next few months, her health began to understandably deteriorate. Meanwhile, out in the streets, Jacques Hébert continued to beat the drum to have her killed, calling her the Austrian she-wolf and the arch-tigress, who has been at the heart of every terrible thing that has befallen France since she first showed up as an awkward teenage girl back in 1770. In many ways, Hébert turned her into this sort of woman of blood, though I don't believe it was ever specifically formulated in that way, and she needed to die for France to be purified. Once the insurrection of September the 5th came and went, the only question was how long until the Queen was executed. They finally called her to the Revolutionary Tribunal on October the 14th, and as I hinted, she wasn't even given the appearance of a real trial. She wasn't even afforded the superficial trappings that the convention had granted her husband, like, say, a lawyer. And what's kind of funny is that a lot of the stuff they accused her of was stuff that they had already convicted her husband of. Remember that business when the Swiss guards showed up at Versailles in 1789 and in the ensuing welcome party they trampled the cockade? Well, having already pinned this affront on the king, the story was now that the Queen was the one who was really behind it. And that veto of the anti-clerical law, well, Louis was now presented as a dupe being controlled by his evil wife who was really behind it. They also accused her of plotting to kill the Duc d'Orléans, which is a bit rich since Orléans himself is already imprisoned and will be convicted by the Revolutionary Tribunal and executed 3 weeks down the road. And FYI, the Duc d'Orléans is the focus of one of those little supplementals I've recorded. Now, most of the charges against her were just run-of-the-mill character assassination stuff, to prove that the Queen needed to die not necessarily for what she had done, but because of who she was. But before you start feeling too sorry for her, as with her husband, the charges against her were sometimes way off base, but other times pretty right on the money. She had absolutely helped organize the flight to Varennes with the intention of escaping France and linking up with the Austrian army. The tribunal had in hand all of her correspondence with the Austrian court, which unequivocally proved that she was not just inviting a foreign army to invade France, but had been positively begging them to do it. And that's treason. But the prosecutors wouldn't just let that obvious charge stand on its own, and so they stooped very low and brought her son out to testify against her. At the pressing of Hébert, the boy had been coached, I'm sure quite violently, to testify that his mother had sexually abused him. Now, the Queen knew she was doomed, and that it was important to maintain stoic calm in the face of all this abuse, but this was beyond the pale, and she angrily admonished her accusers for asking her to respond to such a crime against nature. And apparently the women in the audience, good revolutionaries all who wanted to see the Austrian she-wolf dead, started making angry noises in the gallery that the prosecution had jumped way over the line. But this last-minute bit of sympathy was not even close to being enough to save Marie Antoinette. On October the 16th, she was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. She held out a bit of hope that she might be granted something resembling the dignity allowed her husband on the day of his execution, but no such luck. She was forced to give her final confession to a patriotic civic priest rather than a clergyman recognized by Rome. Then, unlike her husband, who had been taken to the scaffold in a closed carriage, the Queen was loaded onto the back of an open tumbril, just like a common criminal. As she rode, hands bound behind her back, Jacques-Louis David dashed off a famous sketch of an unhappy woman who yet kept her back straight and her head held high. When she was led up onto the scaffold and towards the guillotine, her last words were allegedly, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it," when she accidentally stepped on the executioner's toes. Then they laid her down, and zip, thud, the end. Her body was then dumped into the same mass grave they had dumped her husband into. After the Restoration, what remained of the royal couple was exhumed. In the king's case, there was really nothing left, since the revolutionaries had covered his body with a double dose of lye to make sure it would fully disintegrate. But the agents of the Restoration did move what was left to the Basilica Saint-Denis, where they remain to this day. After dispensing with the Queen, the Revolutionary Tribunal returned to the Girondins, who just kept making a nuisance of themselves by refuting point by point every charge levied against them. If this kept up, they might actually wriggle away from the hand of revolutionary justice. So on October the 29th, the Committee of Public Safety issued a fateful decree. From now on, trials would have a time limit. If, after 3 days, enough evidence had been submitted to establish guilt, then that was it. End of trial. There was no sense in letting the enemies of France spin endless sophistries to explain away their guilt. So in accordance with this new decree, the trial of the Girondins was cut off on October the 30th. The jury has heard quite enough. Thank you very much. When the final verdict was read out, guilty on all counts, of course, the Girondins acted each in his own way, some rising to their feet to furiously denounce the entire proceedings. Rousseau allegedly just slumped down in his chair. Another guy fell right out of his chair, and people in the audience thought that he had fainted or something, until they rolled him over and discovered he had smuggled a knife in and had just committed suicide. But don't worry, they'll load his corpse into the guillotine and cut his head off anyway. After spending a final night together in the conciergerie, the 22 Girondins were loaded onto the tumbril the next morning. The great orator Vergniaud, who had, of course, prophesied all this, considered ingesting some poison that he had kept at hand just, in case, but he decided to go out with his friends instead. In the tumbril, on the way to the scaffold, they all sang La Marseillaise together. Where Marie Antoinette had kept her head held high as a martyr for the monarchy, the Girondins kept their heads held high as martyrs for the revolution. They knew they were patriots, They knew this was unjust, and that history would vindicate them. The guillotine then dispatched them one by one, 22 heads in 36 minutes. When the revolution devours her children, she devours them quickly. So, we're going to leave it off there for now. As I've mentioned a few times, I am about to embark on the next round of Revolution tours, and I'll be spending the next 3 weeks in England and France, and then Boston and Philadelphia. We will officially return to our main story on May the 17th. We get into the Law of 14 Frimaire and the Committee of Public Safety's final consolidation of power. In the meantime, I have written and recorded 3 supplemental episodes to tide you over. The first will be about the new Republican calendar, which is just now, in October 1793, being adopted, and that will help explain to you what 14 Frimaire even means. The second one will be about the Duc d'Orléans, who is still occasionally accused of being the puppet master behind the early days of the Revolution. And then the third supplemental will be a highly entertaining side trip across the Atlantic, where we will watch George Washington get driven absolutely nuts by Citizen Genet, the French Revolution's ambassador to the United States. Meanwhile, I will be off on a grand adventure that you really should join me for the next time we do it. Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 3.34a, The Republican Calendar. So greetings from the past. By the time this episode goes live, I think I will be in London. Did you guys know that Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne is buried in Westminster Abbey? If I've played my cards right, then I was there yesterday and should have already taken a picture of me with my Gentleman Johnny t-shirt standing next to his marker. And we'll see if the hotel Wi-Fi lets me upload a picture of that along with the episode. Anyway, we are here today to talk about the famous French Republican calendar, the attempt by the revolutionaries to completely reinvent how humans mark the passage of time. When you head out there into the world, you might find people calling it the French Revolutionary Calendar, but as we'll see in a second, that is actually a misnomer, and for a very particular reason. But if you accidentally call it the French Revolutionary Calendar, don't beat yourself up. And if you hear somebody call it the French Revolutionary Calendar, don't beat them up. It's no big deal. And nobody likes a pedant. After the fall of the Bastille in July 1789, patriotic revolutionaries took to informally calling it the dawn of the era of liberty, and often specifically referring to 1789 as year one of the Age of Liberty. But this was all merely poetic expression. As the revolution progressed, however, more and more stuff started happening and more things started getting reformed, time itself did finally come under scrutiny. As you may know, space came under scrutiny as well, which is where the meter comes from, but that's a story for another day, because we're here to talk about revolutionary time, not revolutionary space. The urge to remake the markers of time really came from 2 main currents. First, Enlightenment science and its desperate obsession with rationalizing everything. And then second, anti-clerical radicals who wanted to abolish any lingering sway held by the Catholic Church on the good citizens and citizenesses of France. After the insurrection of August the 10th, which seemed to have finally truly swept aside the Ancien regime, the movement to remake the calendar went from interesting conversation in the salons to actual working commission of the National Convention. Now, just to get this out of the way, technically, the National Convention rushed ahead on this, and just as they were abolishing the monarchy in September 1792, they also declared 1792 year one of the French Republic, and ordered all public documents to be so dated. But it was only public documents that were so dated, and it's unclear just how widespread the practice was. Plus, there was some disagreement about when exactly the year should start, and whether the rest of the calendar should be kept or whether a whole new system should be devised. So, the convention appointed a commission to make a recommendation. This commission was chaired by Charles Gilbert Rome, who was by disposition a mathematician, but who had also become a prominent national politician since being elected into the Legislative Assembly in 1791. Rome gathered up a collection of men to help study the issue and make a recommendation, and though the majority of the men he consulted were all Enlightenment science nerds, mostly astronomers, chemists, geographers, and mathematicians, there were also a few appointees from the more liberal arts side of the world, the most prominent being poet, playwright, and spinner of fictitious foreign plots, Fabre d'Eglantina. Now, the first major question that presented itself was, are we going to craft a revolutionary calendar or a republican calendar? If it was the former, then obviously 1789 is year 1, and we are currently in year, well, wait a minute, are we in year 4 or have we moved into year 5? If we say year 1 was 1789, do we mean starting January the 1st, 1789, or like July the 14th, 1789? But luckily, we don't have to linger on that particular debate because the commission soon decided it wasn't going to be a revolutionary calendar. It was going to be a republican calendar, and they decided to fix the beginning of the new year 1 at the moment the monarchy was abolished on September the 22nd, 1792. But because the commission was full of science nerds, they couldn't just leave it at the anniversary of the abolition of the monarchy. They said, hey, look, that just so happens to coincide with the autumnal equinox, so we'll say that the year starts at midnight on the day of the autumnal equinox, which leads to some weirdness because the autumnal equinox floats around a little bit. So like in 1795, the first day of the Republican year would actually correspond to September the 23rd, and in 1803, it would actually correspond to September the 24th. This will lead to all kinds of weird conversion problems for historians, but let's not get into it right now. Setting aside the scientific problem of when to start the calendar, we can certainly say that poetically and politically it begins at the dawn of the Republic. After that, each Republican year would be divided into 12 months, same as before. Now, for a bunch of guys who are utterly obsessed with the number 10, I find it interesting that they didn't go with a 10-month year, but that would have obviously run into a couple of other problems. For one thing, these guys were super hot on the idea of a 10-day week, and there's not really any good way to make the math work if you're trying to cram 10-day weeks into 36-day months. The other thing is that these guys were all natural scientists and recognized that the year was divided into 4 distinct seasons, partitioned by the equinoxes and the solstices. So they kept the 12-month year, each month being divided into 3 10-day weeks for a total of 30 days each. But wait, you say, that's only 360 days. What about the other 5 days? And what do you do with leap years? Well, hold your horses. We'll get to it. Now, one of the big impetuses for the calendar, as I said, was the desire to break the long-ingrained Catholic habits of the French people, most especially the every 7 days is a Sunday, and that is our day of rest. That 7-day rhythm would keep the people of France rooted in superstition, so the calendar tried to break the habit, which is why they were more interested in a 10-day week than a 10-month year. And in case you're wondering what the single least popular aspect of the Republican calendar was, well, here you go. Because good luck getting the peasants not to resent the heck out of you telling them that they get a day off now every 10 days rather than every 7 days. Getting deeper into the decimalization of everything, the new Republican day would be divided into 10 hours, and each hour would be divided into 100 minutes, and each minute would be divided into 100 seconds, and so on into infinity. A Republican hour was thus 144 old-style minutes, and a Republican minute was 86.4 old-style seconds. Now, if all of this seems like a really difficult thing to actually implement, you are right. And though it was all mandated, no one really tried to enforce it, and it would be quietly dropped in 1795. There was, however, a little time where watches were manufactured on this decimal time system. And you can see some of them on display at the Museum of Arts and Crafts in Paris, though I don't think that translation is really right. I think it's more like the Museum of Science and Industry. Anyway, I am going to try to pop in and go check some out when I'm in Paris. No one bought them, though, except for French revolutionary science nerds, so there aren't actually that many of them left. Okay, so we've got our 12 months, each divided into 3 weeks of 10 days each. But our science nerds on the committee forgot that they were handing this off to real people who would actually have to use it in the real world. So dating things the first day of the third decade of the seventh month of year 2 might be accurate, but it was clunky as hell. So that's when Fabre d'Eglantina steps into the picture and makes his other great contribution to the French Revolution. D'Eglantina said, let's give this cold math a little bit of romance. So he set his imagination to work on a naming scheme for all the months. Now, since the calendar was built around the natural rhythms of the year, d'Eglantina used that as the basis for his new naming scheme. The months would be grouped by season and given names to invoke a relevant aspect of that season. Since the calendar starts with the autumnal equinox, the first 3 months of the year are the autumn months, starting with Vendimaire for the grape harvest, then Plumaire for fog, Frimaire for frost. And just so you know, d'Eglantina is making these words up by mashing together Greek or Latin with French to get something that just kind of sounded cool. Okay, so moving on to winter, you have Nivos for snow, Pluvios for rain, and Ventos for wind. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of all these, but what can you do? Then in the spring is Germinal for germination, Floreal for flower, and Prairial for pasture. And then finally in the summer you get Messidor for harvest, Thermidor for heat, and Fructidor for fruit. But wait, there's more. Though they ultimately kept the names of the days simply first day, second day, third day, etc., d'Eglantina decided to riff on the old Catholic idea where every day of the year has a designated saint. So, in keeping with the natural pastoral romance of his naming scheme, d'Eglantina decided to use designated days to celebrate the wonders of agriculture. Every day was assigned a different object of reflection or contemplation. Most of these objects of reflection were vegetables or plants, apple, spinach, rose. The only exception was the month of Nivos, the first month of winter, corresponding roughly with January. In that month, the plants were replaced by minerals, so like flint and granite, things like that. But interspersed with all these plants were 2 other classes of objects. Every 5th day of the week was reserved for a common animal, like a dog or a pig or a goose. And then the 10th days were always dedicated to an agricultural tool, like the plow or the cart or the pitchfork. And I'm not sure if this was on purpose, but there's something kind of obnoxious about reserving the day of rest for a work tool. I mean, you finally get a day where you don't have to plow anything, and Fabre d'Eglantina wants you to sit around contemplating your plow. That just doesn't seem right. So now we can finally get back around to those extra 5 days at the end of the year, since 12 times 30 only equals 360, not 365. Those extra days were originally called simply complementary days, but the poetic d'Eglantina said no, we will call them the Sansculotides, because what's a little naked political pandering between friends? Each day of the Sansculotide would be dedicated to a different trait worthy of admiration. So the first complementary day would be given over to genius, or talent, depending on the translation, and celebrate the great inventions or innovations of the year. The second day would be for labor, celebrate industry and production. The third day would be to policy, to celebrate all the best laws and decrees that the people had found most beneficial over the previous year. The fourth would be for honors or rewards, where the best exemplars of the previous 3 days' aspects would get like blue ribbons and stuff for their good work. The fifth day would be given over to opinion or conviction, which d'Eglantina thought would be a day you could get together and criticize the government, make fun of leaders, ironically mock whatever you liked with perfect freedom from punishment. And this fifth day of the Sansculotide should tell you just about everything you need to know about how far civil rights have fallen on the revolution's list of priorities. Because in a nation that respects freedom of speech, you don't really need a special day where you can criticize the government without fear of reprisal. Anyway, on designated leap years, there would be a sixth complementary day dedicated to celebrating the revolution itself. Now, after d'Eglantina presented this list of festivals, the incorruptible Robespierre made what he considered an essential alteration. The day of policy would be removed in favor of a day celebrating virtue, and virtue would be celebrated on the first day. When d'Eglantina protested a bit, Robespierre said virtue is more important than genius. Was not Cato a better man than Caesar? And random editorializing from the guy who brought you the history of Rome, I'm not really sure Cato was a better man than Caesar. The French Republican calendar was introduced to the convention on September the 23rd, 1793, and officially sanctioned by the National Convention on October the 24th. It would be in effect until Napoleon finally abolished it in 1805, aka Year 14, as a part of his wide-ranging program to reconcile the old ways with the new ways. The period when the calendar is in effect, of course, causes all kinds of headaches for students because from here on out, all the important dates in the history of the French Revolution will reference the Republican calendar. That's why it's called the Thermidorian Reaction, and the coup of 18 Fructidor, and the coup of 30 Prairial, and the coup of 18 Brumaire. FYI, there's a lot of coups coming up. But just so you know, I am not going to start using the new calendar to do anything but point out why some event gets its name. So, when Fabre d'Eglantina, for example, gets hauled off to the guillotine, I'll still say that he dies April the 5th, 1794. But when Robespierre gets his face blown off, I'll tell you that it happened on July the 27th, 1794, but I'll also make sure to mention that it happened on 9 Thermidor Year 2, because that's how the event gets referenced in a lot of history books out there. And that's where it gets its name, the Thermidorian Reaction. Okay, so that does it for the Republican calendar, and hopefully you now have a better idea of why things are going to be called what they will be called. And I will see you all next week, which according to that calendar would be the 5th of Floréal, year 223, for a brief look back on the life and career of alleged revolutionary puppet master Philippe Égalité. This week's episode is brought to you by lynda.com. Lynda.com is the online learning platform with over 3,000 on-demand video courses to help you strengthen your business, technology, and creative skills. For a free 10-day trial, visit lynda.com/revolutions. That's lynda.com/revolutions. Lynda.com is for problem solvers, for the curious, for people who want to make things happen. Maybe you want to master Excel, learn new negotiation tactics, build a website, or boost your Photoshop skills. Go to lynda.com and feed your curious mind. I can heartily recommend all their audio and video software tutorials, but I am about to start plowing my way through Lynda's extensive library of business skills tutorials. Accounting fundamentals, finance fundamentals, income tax fundamentals. It's about time I started taking this stuff seriously. With a lynda.com membership, you can watch and learn from top experts, stream thousands of video courses on demand, and learn at your own schedule. The courses are structured so you can watch them from start to finish or consume them in bite-sized pieces. You can browse each course's transcript to follow along, or search for an answer and skip to that point in the video. Take notes as you go and refer to them later. You can download tutorials and watch them on the go, including access on your iOS or Android device. You can create and save playlists of courses you want to watch to customize your learning path, or share it with friends and colleagues or other team members. Your lynda.com membership will give you unlimited access to training on hundreds of topics, all for one flat rate. Whether you're looking to become an industry expert, you're passionate about a hobby, or you just want to learn something new, I want you to visit lynda.com/revolutions to sign up for your free 10-day trial. That is lynda.com/revolutions. Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 3.34b, Philippe Égalité. As I mentioned back in episode 3.25, the Duc d'Orléans, the renegade prince of the blood who was now styling himself Philippe Égalité, deserves more attention than I have been able to give him. Since he is about to get his head chopped off, I figured that now would be the perfect time to try to correct this oversight. So, without further ado, let's hop in the Wayback Machine and head back into the days of the Ancien Regime, because the story of the coming of the French Revolution is absolutely not complete without explaining the part played by the Duc d'Orléans. Young Louis-Philippe Joseph d'Orléans was born in 1747 into the House of Orléans, the senior cadet branch of the Royal House of Bourbon. His grandfather was Philippe Duc d'Orléans, a younger brother of King Louis XIV, and it was to him that both the family name and their cadet branch status trace back to. The Orléans branch, being so close to the immediate royal family but just outside of it, earned their senior male patriarchs the distinction of being the first prince of the blood, an official court position reserved for the most senior royal prince not in the king's immediate family. What this meant in practice was that if all the inner circle Bourbons were to die out, the throne would pass to the House of Orléans, and that is going to be important. When Louis-Philippe was 22, he married one of his cousins, Louisa Marie, who happened to be the daughter of an insanely wealthy duke, who himself happened to be the son of one of King Louis XIV's legitimized illegitimate children, if you can follow along with that. So, Louise Marie's dowry, combined with the already huge estates of the House of Orléans, meant that when Louis-Philippe inherited the title Duc d'Orléans from his father, he became one of the richest men in France. This is also going to be important. Now, from very early on, Louis-Philippe cultivated an antagonistic edge in his dealings with the king's immediate royal family. He first ran afoul of them in the early 1770s, when Lord Chancellor Maupeou made his play at shutting down the Parlement, which we talked about way back in episode 3.3. While Louis-Philippe, not yet Duc d'Orléans, set himself up as a champion and patron of the Parlement. For this, he earned popular acclaim and the enmity of the king's ministry, and a lettre de cachet was issued exiling him from Paris. Not the last time that would happen. He kept up his tweaking of the Bourbons after Louis XVI ascended to the throne, and it took no time at all for Louis-Philippe and Marie Antoinette to come to utterly despise each other. When his father died in 1785, Louis-Philippe became the Duc d'Orléans, and first prince of the blood, which rankled the king's inner circle to no end. He also inherited the Palais Royal, a huge palace just a few blocks from the Tuileries in Paris. One of the subtle little quirks of Ancien Regime law was that royal residences, like the Palais Royal, were not subject to official censorship laws. So when Orléans inherited the property, he threw its doors open to the public and basically created a safe space to print and distribute material that might otherwise run afoul of the censors. The arcades of the Palais were soon brimming with shops and cafes and books, pamphlets and newspapers that advocated all kinds of crazy stuff were distributed at will. So, just as the pre-revolution was heating up, the Palais Royal served as the great clearinghouse for any and all dangerously seditious notions like, hey, maybe we should call the Estates General again. This political and literary patronage made Orléans very popular with the people and very unpopular with the inner royal family, most especially Queen Marie Antoinette, who saw in everything Orléans did further proof that he was going to try to overthrow the Bourbons and set himself up as king. Now, for his part, Orléans hated the queen right back, believing her to be a frivolous spendthrift whose loyalty to France was suspect at best. So the really critical thing to understand here is that in the late 1780s, when the political and economic reform movement was running into Enlightenment philosophy, which was running into complaints about the king and the church, they were all coming together in the Palais Royal, which was owned and operated by the Duc d'Orléans. So, though the queen's paranoia about her husband's cousin went too far, she blamed him for everything, it's really not hard to see why she thought him and his money were behind all the misfortunes that were about to befall her family. When the monarchy went bankrupt and Controller General Calonne had to call the Assembly of Notables in 1787, the Duc d'Orléans was of course invited, because he had to be invited. He was the first prince of the blood. and he, of course, became the most prominent critic of Calonne's reform package. Then, during the disastrous royal session of November 1787 that we talked about in episode 3.7, that was when the king was supposed to make nice and instead went off script and demanded fealty to his will, it was the Duc d'Orléans who got up and stammered that what the king was doing was illegal. And this affront got Orléans exiled from Paris again, helping to spark another round of pointed complaints against the whole lettre de cachet system that was now being used to silence the great patron of French liberty. When the Estates General was finally called in the spring of 1789, the Duc d'Orléans was of course elected to the Second Estate, and he was clearly ready to stand out as one of the liberal noble champions of the Third Estate. After Louis failed to intimidate the Third Estate during another disastrous royal session, the Duc d'Orléans was the one who led the delegation of 47 nobles into the now self-proclaimed National Assembly, which effectively ended any possibility that the estates might be kept separate. This forced Louis to call on everyone else to come together. We talked about all of this back in episode 3.10. Now, as if all this standing up to the king wasn't bad enough, do you remember where it was that Camille Desmoulins gave his famous speech that roused Paris to arms and led directly to the fall of the Bastille in July 1789? That's right, he delivered it from atop a café table in the Palais Royal. This left no doubt in the minds of the king's immediate family that the Duc d'Orléans was orchestrating the revolution to oust them from power and get himself crowned king. But though this all looks really suspicious, Orléans is actually not much of an arch puppeteer. What's going on here is that the French Revolution was a time of rampant paranoia, when everyone, royalists and moderates and revolutionaries, whoever, were all convinced that everyone else was a part of some vast sinister plot to destroy them. So, while the royal family was now convinced that Orléans was a revolutionary mastermind, really, he was just a rich liberal noble who enjoyed tweaking his cousins. If he was really aiming to overthrow them, he certainly never did much to finally close the deal. And indeed, once things started getting a little nuts in 1789, Orléans backed off and attempted to get right with the king and queen. He even accepted an order to leave the country and go on a little diplomatic mission up to England when the king asked him to. And then, if there was ever a moment for Orléans to try to capitalize on all this alleged sinister plotting, it was right after the flight to Varennes, when the king and queen were utterly discredited and suspended from power. But the Duc d'Orléans made no attempt to seize the crown. He, of course, had followers pushing him in that direction, but instead of doing that, we find evidence that he actually tried to help his cousins through the crisis. But of course, by that point, they were so ticked off at him that they rejected all his overtures. After the flight to Varennes, Orléans decided that the time had finally come to make a good show of his permanent commitment to the revolution, and he started publicly calling himself Citizen Philippe Égalité, and it was under that name that he was elected to the National Convention in September 1792. But once in the convention, Philippe Égalité discovered that the times had really changed around him. He sat with Robespierre in the mountain, but even as he tried to keep up with the times, he discovered that he was now little more than an embarrassment and a liability for the mountain. This was the age of the Republic, and despite his superficial name change, everyone knew he was a prince of the blood. The charge that he had made revolution to get himself crowned king was no longer an accusation thrown at him by right-wing conservatives, but rather now by left-wing radicals. In their war on the mountain, the Girondins twice made direct attacks on Philippe and accused the mountain of being his accomplices, which forced the mountain into the uncomfortable position of defending Philippe Égalité, and saying, well, now this is all a bunch of crazy talk, he's not really like that. But even they had doubts about his real motives. When the time came to sit in judgment on the king, and Philippe Égalité voted death without appeal, it was impossible, even for his alleged allies, to not believe that he wasn't still trying to pave the way for his own coronation. Whether he really wanted to be king or not is a mystery of his inner mind that we'll likely never know the answer to. But if Philippe Égalité did want to be king, he pretty much blew any shot he had at it quite a long time ago. In the spring of 1793, he was finally brought down by events outside his control, As we talked about back in episode 3.27, when General Dumouriez defected, Philippe Egalité's firstborn son and heir went with him. When this defection led to a general crackdown on aristocrats still in France, there was nothing Philippe Egalité could say or do to avoid getting swept up by the authorities. His son had just been an accomplice to one of the great treasonous betrayals of the whole revolution. Philippe Egalité was arrested in April 1793, and all his assets were seized. Once this is all said and done, I have some ambition to cobble together a book on the children that the revolution devoured, and the first chapter will be about the Duc d'Orléans, who did so much in the late 1780s to harbor political dissidents and create a hotbed of activism that fed directly into the revolution, and who then gave so much patronage and money to the cause in the early going. I mean, he gave it protection when no one else would. He was so involved in the early days that, as I said, the king and queen truly thought that the entire revolution was a massive plot by the Duc d'Orléans to oust them from power. But that turned out to not really be the case, and it is a little bit ironic that those same accusations were the accusations that would bring him down, but they would ultimately come from the left, not the right. Philippe Egalité languished in prison until November, but once the Reign of Terror got going, he was moved quickly to the front of the line, what with being a prince of the blood and all. On November the 6th, 1793, Philippe Egalité, formerly Duc d'Orléans, was tried, convicted, and guillotined, all on the same day. But there is an interesting little postscript to all this. After Napoleon went down, and the brothers of Louis XVI came back into town to restore the monarchy, they wound up running an arch-conservative kingdom that, in the words of Talleyrand, had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. So after about 15 years of enduring the Bourbons attempting to turn French citizens back into French subjects, the French got sick of it all and overthrew the restored Bourbons in July 1830. The man they turned to lead a new constitutional monarchy was the Duc d'Orléans' son, Louis Philippe. So, just as Marie Antoinette feared, the House of Orléans did eventually succeed in overthrowing and replacing the House of Bourbon. It just took a little longer than she thought. Okay, so next week there will not be an episode because I only managed to crank out 3 supplementals before I left. But when we return in 2 weeks, I will be just getting back from the first ever American Revolution tour, and to celebrate, I wrote up a little thing on the young French ambassador dispatched by the National Convention in early 1793 to drum up support for revolutionary France in the new United States of America. With all of Europe now arrayed against them, it was critical that France secure support from their Republican brothers in the New World, which is why it was so unfortunate that the young ambassador the convention sent was the needlessly provocative and endlessly infuriating Citizen Genet. This week's episode is brought to you by lynda.com. Lynda.com is the online learning platform with over 3,000 on-demand video courses to help you strengthen your business, technology, and creative skills. For a free 10-day trial, visit lynda.com/revolutions. That's lynda.com/revolutions. Lynda.com is for problem solvers, for the curious, for people who want to make things happen. Maybe you want to master Excel, learn new negotiation tactics, build a website, or boost your Photoshop skills. Go to lynda.com and feed your curious mind. I can hardly recommend all their audio and video software tutorials, but I am about to start plowing my way through Lynda's extensive library of business skills tutorials, accounting fundamentals, finance fundamentals, income tax fundamentals. It's about time I started taking this stuff seriously. With a lynda.com membership, you can watch and learn from top experts, stream thousands of video courses on demand, and learn at your own schedule. The courses are structured so you can watch them from start to finish or consume them in bite-sized pieces. You can browse each course's transcript to follow along, or search for an answer and skip to that point in the video. Take notes as you go and refer to them later. You can download tutorials and watch them on the go, including access on your iOS or Android device. You can create and save playlists of courses you want to watch to customize your learning path, or share it with friends and colleagues or other team members. Your lynda.com membership will give you unlimited access to training on hundreds of topics, all for one flat rate. Whether you're looking to become an industry expert, you're passionate about a hobby, or you just want to learn something new, I want you to visit lynda.com/revolutions to sign up for your free 10-day trial. That is lynda.com/revolutions. Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 3.34C, Citizen Genet. So this week's supplemental is an outgrowth of two things. First, listener James Ruff's question during the 250th episode about American attitudes toward the French Revolution. So congratulations, James, this episode is partly your fault. But it also comes from another little project that I'll go ahead and tease right now. For those of you who are also Dan Carlin fans, he may have directed you over to this debut episode of the 10 American Presidents podcast that he narrated about Richard Nixon for British podcaster Royfield Brown. Well, Royfield talked me into doing the Washington episode, which should be coming out at some point soon, and there's already a little short pre-interview with me about George Washington posted up already. If you Google 10 American Presidents podcast, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. So between the 250th episode and preparing to talk about George Washington for roughly 30 hours straight, I got deep into the weeds of the thoroughly entertaining Citizen Genet affair. Edmond Charles Genet was born in 1763 in Versailles. He was the youngest of 9 children and the son of the head clerk of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So his father basically ran the central clearinghouse for correspondence and intelligence during the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence. So from the day he was born, Genet was immersed in the world of international politics. Young Edmund was also something of a precocious little genius, and by the time he hit puberty, he was fluent in 6 different languages, though, as we will see, not one of those languages was the language of diplomacy. At the age of 18, he was appointed to a position as court translator, and then in 1788, at the ripe old age of 25, Genet was dispatched on his first foreign assignment, joining the French embassy attached to the court of Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg. This was, of course, just before the revolution broke out, and when it did, Genet was a pretty staunch supporter. After a childhood spent in the palace at Versailles, and now a year spent at the opulent court of Catherine the Great, Genet had come to loathe the extravagant despotism of old Europe, and it would appear that he was unable to keep his disdain for the trappings of monarchy to himself. After one too many indiscretions, Catherine got sick of him and declared him persona non grata in 1792, calling his presence in Russia both superfluous and intolerable. Once back in Paris, the insurrection of August the 10th upended everything, and after the National Convention convened, Genet was appointed ambassador to the United States, surely the one country on earth that might stick with revolutionary France now that it was a republic. But keep in the back of your mind that Genet received this appointment in the early days of the convention, when the Girondins still held the levers of power. Once winter passed and war with the rest of Europe declared, Genet sailed away from France and landed in Charleston, South Carolina on April the 8th, 1793. Word of his arrival preceded him, and when he landed, he found himself an immediate smash hit. The Southern Jeffersonians were far more enthusiastic about the French Revolution than the Northern Federalists were, so Genet was welcomed with open arms in South Carolina, and a string of parties were thrown in his honor. Genet loved every minute of it, and the citizens of Charleston appeared to love every minute of him. He was young, still just 30 years old. He was handsome and charming and flamboyant and bursting with revolutionary confidence. He encouraged his new American friends to call him Citizen Genet instead of Monsieur, as was now the style in Republican Paris. Besides enjoying the trappings of being a celebrity, Genet had a list of things that were expected of him now that he was in the United States. He was to secure U.S. support and maybe even protection for French colonies in the West Indies. He was to press for early repayment of debts that the Americans had racked up during the War of Independence. He was to negotiate a new commercial treaty to help keep France supplied with all the stuff they were now having a hard time scrounging up. All of that would have to wait, though, until he got up to the American capital in Philadelphia. But there was another thing on his to-do list that he could get going on right now. According to the American-French Treaty signed back in 1778, French privateers based in American ports could go out and attack British merchant ships and then come back to those American ports with their prizes. So, with the blessing of South Carolina's governor, Genet commissioned 4 new privateer ships and issued them official certificates under the protection of French law. Not without a certain flair, these 4 ships were dubbed the Republican, the Anti-George, the Sans-Culotte, and the Citizen Genet. Up in Philadelphia, the arrival of Citizen Genet was more a cause for concern than celebration for President George Washington and his cabinet. It was still unclear whether the Treaty of 1778 was still operative, signed as it was by a man who had just gotten his head chopped off. Washington himself sure didn't think it was operative anymore, and he believed with every fiber of his being that the United States was best served by remaining neutral in any European war. The young country was simply not strong enough to play ball on that level. So on April the 18th, Washington posed a set of wide-ranging questions to his cabinet on the immediate and future course of American foreign policy. But really, it all boiled down to whether the United States should issue a neutrality proclamation. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, not wanting any part of a French alliance, recommended immediately declaring neutrality. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, who may have welcomed a French alliance but knew Washington was wary, said that the United States should hedge its bets. We'll let the French make their offer, and then let the British make their offer, and then we'll decide which is better. But in making this suggestion, Jefferson read Washington all wrong. The president was not happy at all about the idea of putting America's sacred honor up on the auction block. So, as he so often did, Alexander Hamilton won the point, and on April the 22nd, George Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation, although technically the word neutrality never appeared. The Neutrality Proclamation ignited a brief firestorm in the Jeffersonian-backed Republican press. They were angry both that Washington was turning his back on an ally that had helped them win independence, and also that he had bypassed Congress to do it. This was just an executive proclamation, which led to murmurings that Washington was trying to make himself a king. Meanwhile, a Citizen Genet was still making his way north. Everywhere he stopped, he was greeted like some kind of popular itinerant preacher spreading the gospel of revolution. As he moved, a new breed of popular clubs began to spring up, clubs that seemed to owe a lot to the model of the Jacobin Club. The first one appeared in Philadelphia in April, and by year's end there would be 10 more, then 20 more the year after that. These popular societies were of course protected by the First Amendment's right to free association, but President Washington did not like them one bit, and in time he would come to actively hate them and suspect them of fomenting treason against the federal government. Almost all of the members of these societies seemed to be ex-anti-federalists, all those guys who had led the charge against the Constitution, and they were now actively cheering on even the most excessive phases of the French Revolution. So there was no telling what these guys might do. It finally took a month for Genet to get from Charleston to Philadelphia, a delay that did not endear him to George Washington even a little bit. On May the 16th, Genet finally entered the capital, and like everywhere else, he was greeted as a hero, and he gave a great speech to an enthusiastic crowd. In the president's house, George Washington wondered when the new ambassador from France was going to get around to actually presenting his credentials to the head of state of the United States of America. When Genet finally did decide to present his credentials, he was greeted with a calculated coldness by Washington. But Genet dismissed the possible implications of this coldness for the success of his mission. He had just spent the last month being convinced that the whole country was with him. Washington's stiff demeanor was just proof that the old general was out of touch. Before Genet arrived in Philadelphia, the source of what would become some pretty explosive tension had already sailed up the Delaware River, a French ship with 2 captured British vessels in tow. After his meeting with the president, Genet set to work rechristening one of those ships La Petite Démocrate, and he commissioned it into his little privateer fleet. Washington was furious that Genet was, in Washington's mind, threatening American neutrality. But Genet believed it was his right under the old treaty to do exactly what he was doing. And besides, he was a popular hero, while old man Washington needed to be put out to pasture. By the beginning of June, even Jefferson was starting to tell Genet to tone it down, that strutting around openly defying George Washington was only hurting their shared cause. Genet replied that Washington had clearly been put under the thumb by the Federalist Party, who were using the doddering president as a puppet to erect an American monarchy. Jefferson was indignant about this reply. Whether he recognized that Genet's confidence was likely fed by propaganda Jefferson's own press hacks were writing, we don't know. As the refitting of La Petite Démocrate neared completion, Genet was busy writing bold letters home that he had the old general on the run and that the people were with him. When the president left the capital for a few weeks on personal business, Jefferson told Genet that he better not try to sail the ship out of the harbor until the president got back. Alexander Hamilton and Secretary of War Henry Knox discussed ramping up the military presence at the mouth of the Delaware to stop La Petite Démocrate if Genet tried to defy the order. But Genet said that he would wait until Washington returned, though he also said that if Washington didn't say it was okay for the ship to set sail, that Genet was going to go over the president's head and appeal directly to the American people. The people, after all, were the true sovereign. Now, a threat like that is, of course, an unthinkable breach of diplomatic protocol, and even Thomas Jefferson now realized that Citizen Genet was turning out to be a disaster. Then, 2 days after saying he wouldn't launch the ship before Washington got back, Genet said, screw it, and launched the ship. When Washington got back to Philadelphia, he was cross-eyed with rage, and he had his cabinet draw up a series of explicit orders laying down the rules of conduct between the neutral Americans and all European belligerents. Privateers cannot be armed in American ports. Their prizes cannot be offloaded in American ports. In response to this, Genet started to follow through with his threat to go over Washington's head. With French sailors roaming Philadelphia getting people riled up, Genet himself delivered a fiery speech that called on the citizens of Philadelphia to defend true liberty, not the crypto-royalist Federalists and their puppet George Washington. For a few nights running, huge crowds roamed the streets, ominously congregating around the president's house and demanding that he declare war on England. This was all, of course, too much for the cabinet, and by the end of July they were deep in discussions about how to demand the recall of Genet without offending the French government. After all, neutrality meant neutrality. The last thing they wanted was for France to declare war on the United States too, and force the country into a fight it didn't want to fight. It was suggested that maybe they deliver all of Genet's impetuous correspondence to Paris and say, look, just send us a guy who won't try to blatantly undermine an elected government. But before they came to any firm decisions, Federalists up in New York, specifically John Jay and Rufus King, took it upon themselves to publish the correspondence. The result was a swift backlash against the French ambassador. Genet had made the mistake of both believing his own hype and the anti-Washington invective streaming off the partisan Jeffersonian presses. He completely missed the fact that George Washington was George Washington. An overwhelming majority of Americans still thought of him as nothing less than a minor deity. Genet had convinced himself that he was beating George Washington in a popularity contest. But when it came out how flagrantly disrespectful he was being, it turned out that he was not. In late August 1793, the cabinet decided it was time to formally demand the recall of Citizen Genet. But of course, We know what has happened back in Paris in the meantime, don't we? That's right. The Girondins that appointed him to his job have been purged from the convention. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the now mountain-controlled convention has already dispatched a replacement for Genet, with orders to maintain friendly relations with the United States, lest they too be pushed into an anti-French coalition. The new ambassador arrived with instructions to arrest Genet and put him on a boat back to France, where he would stand trial for his crimes. And everyone knew exactly what that meant. The once haughty and disrespectful Genet then came down and begged Washington for asylum. At the urging of no less an advisor than Alexander Hamilton, the president granted the request. They may not like the bugger, but they weren't going to send him to his death just for being obnoxious. So, Genet stayed in America. For the rest of his life, as it turned out. He wound up wooing the daughter of hugely powerful New York Governor George Clinton, and then settled into a life of rustic tranquility. Having thus avoided being guillotined at the age of 30, Citizen Genet lived out his days on a comfortable little estate overlooking the Hudson River. In a last act of revolutionary patriotism, he died at the ripe old age of 71 on July the 14th, 1834, the 45th anniversary of the fall of the Bastille.